the Fed, the media, and misinformation. I'm going to reveal the connection between all three of these right here, right now. And of course, I'm going to explain it to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's start with the Fed has no close. The sooner you realize this, the better you're going to be. Let's go into a couple charts. First, a very familiar one, the Fed's BS. It starts in 2004, goes all the way to 2020 on the left, from 1 trillion up to 8 trillion. Goes along very steady until we get to the GFC, quantitative easing 1. The balance sheet goes parabolic, straight up over $2 trillion or so. You can see my handwriting with these charts is extremely accurate. But by the time we get up to 2014, the balance sheet up over 4.5 trillion, and you all know what's happened with the cerveza sickness. It's gone parabolic once again, over $7 trillion. But let's remember, this entire time, the Fed has had a target of 2% inflation rate. And what we're always led to believe is that the Fed is completely powerful. They can control anything. We've got the Fed put. They can support the market. They can create inflation. They can lower or raise unemployment. They can do anything they want just by going out there with all of the tools they have in their bag. That's what I'm really trying to get at here. But let's look at what actually happened with inflation since they took their balance sheet up over 2 trillion, up over 4 trillion, and now up over 7 trillion. The second chart, same thing, starts at 2004, goes over to 2020. On the left, we go from a negative 4% up to 6%. This, of course, is the CPI, inflation, the way they themselves measure it. But I would challenge you to look at this chart of the CPI and the Fed's balance sheet and find any correlation whatsoever. In fact, if we draw a line here, it's not completely accurate. Editor, go ahead and throw up the chart. But from 2008 or 9 or so, we'll draw a line directly through the 2% target rate, and you'll see that for the majority of that time, over a decade, inflation was under their 2% target. And I know the CPI isn't an accurate reflection of the real rate of inflation, but when we're looking at the results and did they achieve them or not, we've got to use their own measuring stick. And again, if you look at their 2% target rate and what they actually achieved, they were in their own no bueno zone almost the entire time. So if they're that good, if they can just whip up inflation anytime they want, Jerome Powell comes out and says, don't you worry, guys, or the market, we're going to let the inflation rate run hot. We're going to let it go over 2%. We're going to have a 2% average. Just you wait and see. But why should we believe anything Jerome Powell says about inflation when they've never been able to produce inflation using their own measurement in the past? It just doesn't make sense. The emperor has no clothes, and the sooner you realize that, the better. And we always hear about the Fed having all of these tools, but we have to realize they only have one trick up their sleeve, and that's creating additional bank reserves. Let's check out what I'm referring to. I've got a diagram of how the Fed used to manipulate interest rates prior to the GFC back in 2008. And even the effectiveness of this system was debatable. But we've got 2 balance sheets here, the Fed and the commercial banking system. If we start with the assets and liabilities of the commercial banking system, we've got treasuries and reserves. And remember, these banks are lending to each other overnight. That's what the Fed funds rate is trying to target. The Fed has treasuries as assets on their balance sheet, and these bank reserves that are assets of the commercial banking system are actually liabilities of the Fed. That's the only trick up their sleeve, is creating or destroying bank reserves. So let's take it another step. We'll say right now that the interest rate, the Fed funds, is 5%, and the Fed wants to lower rates. Prior to 2008, according to the textbook, the way they did this is they would buy these treasuries from the commercial banking system, create more bank reserves. Therefore, if there were more bank reserves that they could lend to each other overnight, it's a simple supply and demand, the interest rate would go down. So the Fed would have those treasuries as an asset, and those additional reserves that had been created would be liabilities on their balance sheet. And at the end of the day, this is really all they can do. And to back up exactly what I've described in this diagram, let's go directly to the Fed's website. So they start by describing how this process worked prior to 2008, which is exactly what I just described up on the whiteboard. And it's very important that we emphasize prior to 2008. The Fed uses its monetary policy tools to influence the supply of money and credit in the economy. It does this primarily by using daily open market operations. When the Fed buys or sells U.S. government securities, it increases or decreases the level or supply of reserves, bank reserves, in the banking system. And you can see their fancy supply and demand chart and how it used to affect interest rates. The supply of reserves increases and those interest rates go down. But again, the point I'm trying to emphasize is the only tool they have is creating or destroying bank reserves. And we move on to the Fed's new monetary policy tools. You would think they would come up with something new and innovative, but whether it's IOR, which is interest on reserves, or RRP, which is reverse repurchase agreements, still the only way they execute these transactions is by, you guessed it, using bank reserves. And they've got another chart that shows how this works. Since 2008, or quantitative easing, the banking system has been flushed with reserves. So the natural interest rate would go down to zero and it wouldn't move. So the only way that they can get the interest rate above zero is through IOER or IOR and RRP. And this is basically just paying the banks a rate of interest to hold their reserves with the Fed. But what are they paying the banks with? Of course, bank reserves. It all goes back to the same thing. And the only tool the Fed has at their disposal, I'll say it one more time, is the creation or the destruction of bank reserves. That's it. So all of these tools we think the Fed has, whether it's IOER, quantitative easing, or inserting themselves into the repo market, it all goes back to the same thing, just creating more bank reserves. So how can we expect them to manage the rate of unemployment? Or in Europe, they've gone so far as to expect the central bank, the ECB, to micromanage climate change. Or here, when you look at one of these congressional hearings, they've got Jerome Powell, Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke up there, and these crazy politicians are asking them how they're going to eradicate poverty or raise the minimum wage. It just won't work. It's complete insanity. At the end of the day, they're a one-trick pony. And we've put all our confidence into this Fed that's all powerful, that can just wave a magic wand and do whatever they want. But when we look at the data, such as these charts, it becomes obvious that the Fed actually has very little power, if any power at all. The only thing they can really do is affect psychology. They play a game with the markets where they try to manipulate them with perception to get the market participants to do their bidding. I just watched just listened to a fantastic podcast with my good buddies Emil Kalinowski, Jeff Snyder, and Brent Johnson. In it, they use an analogy of a bucket, and the water goes into the bucket, meaning bank reserves, but how do those reserves, how did the liquidity get out of the bucket into the real economy to create inflation? I'd like to use the bucket to illustrate my own type of analogy. Let's assume we've got this bucket right in front of us and it's absolutely infinite. It's the Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond bucket. The only thing the Fed can do is fill it with water. That's it. That's it. And if that water needs to seep out of the bucket to create inflation, let's say, or to create additional broad money in the real economy chasing goods and services, the Fed needs a market participant, such as the banks or the people borrowing money, to actually poke a hole in the bucket to let that water out. You see, that's what we need to understand. We've got this bucket. The only thing the Fed can do is fill it with water. And that theoretically doesn't do anything because that water never gets out into the real economy. They need market participants to poke those holes in the bucket to let the water out. And that's where psychology comes into play. That's why I think you'll see the Fed with their language get more and more extreme when they're not able to achieve these objectives, such as inflation moving forward. Jerome Powell comes out and says, okay, guys, you better get ready because we're going to let inflation run hot. Well, when that doesn't work, what are they going to do? The only thing they can do is create more bank reserves. And that's the definition of insanity when you do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. The only thing they're going to be able to do is jawbone the market. Try to make you believe that the Fed can produce all of this scary inflation by saying, okay, now we're going to not only let it go to 2%, we're going to let it go to 10% or 15%. But sooner or later, the market is going to realize that the emperor or the Fed has no clothes. The only thing they have is psychology, perception, and manipulation. Step number 2, the media's dark secrets they don't want you to know about. We're going to expose this right here, and it starts with understanding who and what influences the content. We all know that these big media companies and networks have a very specific target audience they're trying to appeal to. Whether it's CNN, they're on the left, Fox News, they're on the right. But to really understand how the media operates, we need to dig even deeper. And this takes us directly to the ownership and who is providing the funding. I had a shocking interview with industry insider and veteran Rick Sanchez on how this whole system operates. This is really going to open your eyes. Editor, let's throw up the clip.
Somewhere along the line, journalistic entities, major newspapers, television stations at the local level, networks, were owned by people whose business was journalism. In other words, the guy who owned your local newspaper in Wichita was a guy who grew up in a family where he essentially had his great-grandfather bought the newspaper, started the newspaper, and that was their business. Somewhere along the line, the business model in the United States the journalistic business model became completely corporatized. So suddenly the people who own journalism are the people who journalists are supposed to be going after. The people who we should question. I'll give you a perfect example. When I was first hired at NBC and I got up there, 9/11 happened. I remember I was there. I was one of the only reporters actually reporting live on that. But I remember immediately after we went back, and I was talking to Lester Holt, who was my buddy back then, who's now the main anchor at NBC. And he and I remember once looked at each other and said, what the hell is going on here? Why are we being encouraged to push this war on Iraq when Iraq did not attack us? We were attacked, obviously, by factions inside Afghanistan. And then we started realizing at the time that we were working for General Electric, which was the company which was going to make the most amount of money from the war in Iraq because they were weapons manufacturers who happened to also own MSNBC. And what we're seeing now in the journalism industry is that type of interlocking connection between people who sit on the boards of NBC, CNN, Fox News, New York Times, you go right down your list, who have interests in telling certain stories and having certain stories not told by these people who they pay very well, by the way, millions of dollars to be the circus show of what's going on in the world. So that in and of itself makes it difficult then for that journalist who, by the way, has 4 kids and a wife or a husband or whatever they have in their family. They're making $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 million being the face, one of the faces of one of these networks. And all they have to do is kind of look the other way when the United States, invades Honduras, which is not good for the viewers, for the consumers of content, for the consumers of news, which is why suddenly the opening comes along and people like George Gammon are suddenly very popular on the Googles, or on the YouTubes, because people are going, well, wait a minute, if I watch CNN or Fox or these other guys, I get very establishment, content, which I know has its limits and can't go outside the box. If I watch this guy, he doesn't have those parameters, so he's allowed to tell me things. He may be full of crap too, but somehow I kind of want to trust this guy a little more. I think he may have more credibility than those guys. But wait a minute, those guys are sitting in Walter Cronkite's chair. What happened? Well, it happened. And suddenly George Gammon has more in common than Walter Cronkite than the guys who are sitting in the chairs that Walter Cronkite used to occupy.
So you see what's happening. Often these news entities solely exist to further the agenda of whomever owns the news corporation or whomever is giving them the funding. So what ends up happening is the stories or the news is actually created. It's not reported. So how this would work is they come into the office on Monday morning and they decide, okay guys, we need to create these stories. So go out there and try to get any facts that you can to build this particular story to further this agenda or this narrative. And BBC, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we get to a point where the only thing that matters is narrative. Facts are completely irrelevant. And a great example of this recently is a BBC show that used my YouTube channel as an example of misinformation on the internet that you really need to look out for, because if you watch these channels like George Gammon's, you're really going to be taken down a path, this rabbit hole, and he's going to manipulate you into doing things that you otherwise wouldn't do. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black. And the easiest way to determine who's trying to manipulate you and who's trying to just inform you is ask yourself the question, who is using facts and who is just sticking to a narrative and ignoring facts altogether. Let's go back to this whiteboard video that I did that the BBC used as misinformation. Well, it may come as no surprise that it was a whiteboard video on the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. So then you'd have to ask the question, I wonder how the BBC is actually getting their funding when there's this huge move in the UK to defund the BBC. And I'm not throwing out any conspiracy theories, but it does make you wonder if the World Economic Forum themselves is funding the BBC. But let's not go down that rabbit hole. Let's stick with the facts. And the facts that I used in this whiteboard video were directly from the World Economic Forum's website. And I'll put a link to that video in the description below. They focused on step number 1 when I outline their agenda, the World Economic Forum's agenda for a great reset that's triggered by this 4th industrial revolution. Their words, not mine. But what this perfectly illustrates is there's a very specific narrative that each news outlet is trying to push. And they form this narrative by not reporting the news, but actually fabricating and creating the news themselves. They totally ignore facts, and the only thing they report as quote-unquote news are things that fit their specific narrative. And if it falls outside of these very defined lines, then they categorize it as misinformation. And of course, the irony is the only one that's pushing misinformation, or the biggest proponents of this misinformation, are the media outlets themselves, who are sitting there pointing the finger at everyone else, while at the same time, they're only doing the bidding of the owners or the people, entities that are giving them their funding. So how does this media game play into what the Fed is doing? Well, let's think this through. The media pushes that there's a Fed put, that the Fed can support the market, or the Fed can easily create inflation. Just turn on CNBC or Bloomberg sometime. Well, why would the owners of these media outlets want that narrative pushed further and further and further? Well, if there's a Fed put, and everyone believes that there is, therefore, when the Fed comes in and does quantitative easing, the stock market goes up, that's going to benefit the ownership in the sense that their share price is going to go through the roof. And I could go down the list of things that they would benefit from by the general public and the marketplace believing these things to be true without actually looking at the underlying data to see that, again, the Fed or the emperor has no clothes, just like we discussed in step number 1. And my prediction is as the Fed's impotence is further displayed to the marketplace over the next however many years, the narrative with the media that they're going to push is going to get worse and worse and worse. It's going to get even more exaggerated. And that's not just with the Fed, but that's also going to be with the divisiveness that we're seeing in the world today. I think at the end of the day, what you have to ask yourself when you're watching a specific news outlet is who actually benefits from the narrative they're trying to push. A great example of this is Bezos buying the Washington Post. And I'm not saying anything good or bad about Bezos, but why on earth would someone like that be motivated to buy an organization that's declining substantially in revenue? And we all know that at a certain point, they're going to become obsolete. The answer to the question is, of course, they don't care about profit. They don't care about revenue. The only thing they care about is influence and manipulation. It takes us right to this media doom vortex that I've got up on the board. But this applies to the Fed as well. It starts with their incentives. And their incentives go right into how they are trying to manipulate the public, just like you and I. The more they can manipulate the public, the more they're brainwashed into doing their bidding, whether it's the media or the Fed. The more this brainwashing works, the more they're incentivized to continue to further their narrative to whatever they want to persuade you to do. Like buy the dip, start a riot, or support a war. Possibly even a civil war. Step number 3, what can you do to solve this problem of media and Fed manipulation? We have to remember that the only power the Federal Reserve has is that you believe they actually matter. The only power the media has is that you still watch. So the solution to the problem is actually quite simple. In fact, you have the power over the Fed. You have the power over the media. The only thing you need to do is pick up that remote control and simply turn them off. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks, media, and big government, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.